Welcome back, everyone. The day is certainly heating up, both metaphorically and literally. The sunshine in London is pretty strong today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the next panel, something so pertinent right now, especially in the wake of some news a couple of weeks ago that NHS England will be permanently sharing medical records with third parties unless you choose to opt out. It's healthcare. Who owns my data? Do you know where your private critical data is stored or who has access to it? Moderating this panel is James O'Shaughnessy, a member of the House of Lords since 2015 and former UK Health Minister with responsibility for technology, digital, and data. He is now a senior partner at Newmarket Strategy and a board director of HDR UK and the health data startup Human.ai. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Ian, and good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be moderating this session. As Ian said, this is an unbelievably important topic. And with me, I have two fantastic panelists to discuss the subject this morning. First, we'll be hearing from Sergey Jakimov. He's the co-founder and CEO of Longenesis. Sergey is a serial entrepreneur, and prior to Longenesis, he founded two companies in engineering and medical devices and has raised more than $30 million into his own ventures and as a consultant to seed-stage biotech startups. He's a co-founder on Longevisy, an early-stage biotech and longevity-focused venture capital fund. Morning, Sergey.
Morning, James. Thrilled to be here.
We also have Miguel Stanley, a dental surgeon from the White Clinic, joining us. Miguel is the clinical director of White Clinic, based in Lisbon, Portugal, which he founded 20 years ago. He's a passionate advocate for high-quality dental care, and his career has been focused on restoring smiles with his interdisciplinary team, using state-of-the-art technology, software, and materials, and a strong sense of ethics and minimal invasiveness to better protect his patients. Morning, Miguel. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get on to the discussion. I'm going to shortly ask the panelists to speak for 3 or 4 minutes each to give their introductory thoughts into the topic. I'm then going to moderate a short discussion. After that, we'll be throwing open to the floor. So please use the question function on Hopin to start logging your questions now, and we will come to those, and I'll try and ask as many as possible. After we've had a discussion, there'll be final closing thoughts from each of the panelists, and we will finish at 11:40. And as ever, please share all of this content on your social media channels, and you have been given the hashtags and other things to refer to it. So, on to the subject matter itself. I think we can all agree that the potential of the world's health data is extraordinary. It has economic value that runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars, and computer science is helping us to unlock its ability to understand and treat disease, as the pandemic has shown us. People now understand the power of this data as never before. At the same time, they're more conscious than ever of the risks of sharing their data, especially incredibly personal data, like data about their genome. And polling shows they're especially concerned about commercial organizations exploiting its value. And underpinning this is a great ambiguity. Who, if anyone, actually owns the data about me? So to discuss this topic today, I'm going to hand over first to Sergey. Sergey, what can this data allow us to do, and how do we persuade the public of its value?
Well, thank you very much, James. Well, I think that the topic of secondary health data usage, first and foremost, is a very complicated one. What I would suggest is that we sort of limit ourselves to talking about how clinical data can be used legitimately to actually accelerate biomedical research, right? Because when you talked about, and you've mentioned these private parties, the third parties that will now have access to data, this is where we're talking about study sponsors, essentially, right? We're talking about pharmaceutical companies, clinical research organizations that might be using this data legitimately, might be using this data to accelerate clinical research. Now, I will be also using a lot of Longenesis examples here because, right, this was the question that we've asked ourselves when we built the company back in the days, and the question was basically, how do you accelerate the drug to market times, right, in the pharmaceutical industry? Because if you look at it, it's still very analog in terms of how pharma sources for patients, how pharma accesses data sets, and how pharma essentially understands where the data sets are, right? And that leads to tremendous times spent to actually get the drug to the market, which is like 10 years and $5 billion US dollars, where most of this time is actually taken by patient recruitment or understanding where patients are or where any other biomedical data assets are, right? So, and our take on it back in the days was, well, why don't you use clinical data? Exactly. Why don't you use clinical data as pointers to patients or to data sets, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have quickly found out was that, well, clinical data is very siloed in clinical institutions, right? So essentially hospitals and clinical sites don't actually know how to use it. And what's most important, they don't have the ability to showcase it to the world, right? So that's your first problem. So how do you identify the cohorts of patients, if you want to identify them, for example, and use the data, clinical data, as pointers if the institutions are not equipped with the tools of how to, show it to the world in the very first place? So that's your identification problem, which stands in the way. And then the second problem is, of course, patient consent, right? Because once you have identified something, you need to ensure that the usage of data is essentially legitimate, right? And to do this, you need to rethink the way of how we onboard patients into clinical trials, right? So we need to do it digitally. We need to record dynamic patient consent as we do it straight away once the patient was identified. But then even if we're talking about accessing data for example, AI purposes or machine learning purposes, we still need to ensure that patient consent is actually recorded properly, right? So these are essentially your two big pillars that you should be talking about. You should be talking about how you identify clinical data assets or patient cohorts in the very first place by using data as pointers. And then how do you onboard patients into clinical trials with patient consent properly recorded, or how do you record patient consent in order to ensure that the data can be used, because patients ultimately are the ones that own the data in the very first place. So when we talk about the value of data and tremendous value of data, what we should understand is that data first should be unlocked, right? Because it is siloed in the institutions and essentially has no value per se, unless you actually prepare it to any sort of sharing, or unless you actually enable the study sponsors or any third parties to access it legitimately. Because right now we're actually in this very unique position in the EU, for example, with the EU Health Data Space Initiative, where on the one hand you need to ensure that the clinical data should be kept local, right? So the data stays local principle. But on the other hand, the institutions are more and more willing to actually engage in research collaborations, right, and engage in data exchange. So you need to equip the stakeholders with the tools and with the approaches which would essentially balance them out, right, between tech and legitimacy of the process.
Thank you, Sergey. There's a lot to unpack in that, and we'll come back to questions around value unlocking, who benefits, and getting patient consent shortly. Miguel, you're a practicing clinician, but you're also a technologist. You harness a lot of technology and generates a lot of data, no doubt. How do you broach that topic with your patients?
I think this is a fascinating topic, and I'm going to talk specifically about the silo of dentistry to keep within my lane, not step on any toes. Dentistry, so I'm part of the Digital Dentistry Society. There's a lot of organizations around the world focusing on the transformation of analog to digital. And that transformation happened as soon as we started having digital patient files. So the second that information went digital, that's when it started. I've been using digital X-rays for 20 years now. That means I have, everything stored where, we're firewalls and all of that. But the question of the day, who owns the big data? We have to understand what data is being generated. So, for example, if you go to a dentist, you have an impression that is taken. It used to be that putty that would go in the mouth. Now you've got intraoral scanners, and that's a file that can be shared. There's so many advantages in acquiring digital data around a patient that can improve workflows, speed up things, allowing dentists to use other labs around the world, reducing costs exponentially for the patients, which is something that is overtly beneficial for everybody. So there's a huge improvement in overall workflow by using digital technologies. But of course, there's the risk of who owns that data and is that data shareable? And I think that as long as the consent forms allow for that data to be shared, then that shouldn't be a problem. And I'll give you an example. In medicine, lectures and conferences and symposiums around the world are a huge way of doctors sharing knowledge, sharing information, so that they can elevate the entire industry. I've lectured in over 50 countries. I've given over 200 keynotes, and thanks to my patients consenting to allow me to share their cases, I can also teach other doctors how to improve. So I think that there's already an acceptance from a huge part of the population in sharing their information if that improves medicine. Of course, there's going to be a huge part of the population that doesn't want their data to be shared. And perhaps in the future, we can see things like, and this is an idea I'm putting out there, like you You have a wallet, like a cryptocurrency wallet. You could have your big data or your healthcare wallet, and every time anything about you is being used anywhere, then you would get a warning on your smartphone, your data is being mined somewhere. And I think that would be something to look into, and I'm sure there's a lot of smart people that can jump onto this. Also, I think that in public healthcare, so we know that in the UK, you've got the NHS, and in many countries around the world, you've got assisted governmental support for healthcare. I think that if anybody wants to jump on free healthcare, they would have to allow tracking. I think that should happen, that to know that they're brushing their teeth, that they're doing things wrong, that they're making good lifestyle choices, and that they're working and collaborating collectively to improve their overall health. And I think that more and more we'll start seeing insurance companies using lifestyle choices as mitigating circumstances to reduce their overall insurance. So for example, if I'm not smoking, I'm not drinking, I have a clean bill of health, I want to let companies use that data so I have a cheaper overall bill at the end of the month with my insurance. So I think that there's a lot of very good things about sharing data. I definitely know in my profession that's really, really a critical time that this data has to be shared. I do, however, think that the patient should have the final say, not in blocking it, but once they've allowed it, understanding that we're here to help, and at least be warned if marketing or companies are trying to mine that through something like a wallet.
Yeah, no, well, really provocative, Miguel, just what we wanted for the discussion. I'm going to follow that up, actually, because I think the two of you have highlighted, well, at least two big issues that I think need exploring. The first is this point about value, and the second is about consent. But if I can start with value, Miguel, you've talked about this idea of, in a sense, having a more interactive relationship between the patient as the generator of data in a clinical setting and those who use it to generate insights and economic value and so on. Do you feel that, so aside from the solution, whether it's a wallet or crypto or whatever, do you feel that we are now at a point where people expect to get some feedback in the value that's being generated? If you think about clinical trials in the past, you would take part, the drug company would find something out, 10 years later they might get a drug. No one in the clinical trial expected to be paid or to get some sort of upside. Do you think things have changed now? The expectations are different?
Well, I think there's two questions there. The first one is patients that contribute to the advancement of medical science. Usually this part of the population are people that will do so to have cheaper healthcare. Do you understand? And then you have the private healthcare segment where I'm in. And that's completely two different worlds, you know, those that can afford their healthcare and those that can't. And we can go back in time and saying, you know, it's why do those two things exist? So let's break it down to the ones that are contributing to the advancements of science and healthcare. I think it would be nice for them to understand that they've contributed to the improvement of something. I think if you're looking at supply chain in so many industries where you can follow the entire supply chain in manufacturing, I think that it will be a no-brainer that within a generation or so, maybe sooner, patients can follow the entire supply chain of what is going into their body and how they've contributed to improving something. I think that big data could really improve things, and not just that, it could also keep a sense of ethics. It also depends on how it's being processed. And from a private sector, I think that there's a lot of companies in artificial intelligence that are now learning how to analyze X-rays, for example, to actually do and to diagnose things a lot faster than humans with a higher degree of accuracy. And we've seen this in cancer treatments, you know, computers finding cancer faster than experienced physicians. So I think that contributing to that form of artificial intelligence in healthcare can only be beneficial, again, as long as there's a beneficial ethical programming behind it.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think what you've described there is there's many ways to think about value and different ways in which you would want to ascribe value. But the important thing is to try and establish a relationship between the researchers, almost a direct relationship between the researchers and patients, so that they can see that there are massive benefits that derive from their involvement. Sergey, as you're actively involved in this area, how do you engage with patients? How do you get them to buy into your value proposition? And more importantly, or just as importantly, how do you make sure that they are fully consented, not just kind of one-off, sign a form, forget about it, but actually active participants in the research?
Well, James, it's a very good question. I would be still a bit cautious. Okay, so I'll be a bit cautious saying, or claiming that we are industrially ready for a very direct relationship between the study sponsor and the patient as an individual, right? So I would be cautious saying that, to be completely honest with you. So we should not discard the role of patient custodians in this process. And by patient custodians and data custodians, for that matter, by patient custodians, I actually mean clinical sites, I mean research organizations, hospitals. Not only those, patient organizations are actually a huge stakeholder in the process, for example. But what I mean by that is that there is always a patient custodian that essentially A, unites patients, right? B, stores their data and processes their data and generates their data as patients are being treated, because the major business of the hospital is, well, treating patients, right? It's not data sharing at the end of the day. So what we should be essentially talking about is not how to build the direct link between the patient, the individual, and let's say a hypothetical, utopian pharmaceutical company. What we should be talking about is, how do you build a direct bridge between the study sponsor and the patient custodian organization that is willing to showcase the data in a compliant manner, of course, showcase the data and essentially allow a study sponsor to browse through, to query through, right? And post essentially direct requests to access certain patient cohorts or certain data sets. And then it's up to the patient custodian. And this is where the role of, for example, NHS, right, which you have mentioned, is tremendous. This is when it's down to the patient custodian to actually engage these patients, right? Because they have the right to process their data. So it's down to them to engage these patients and ask for relevant permissions and ask for relevant consent to be actually given by the patients, right? So there have been, and I actually liked what Miguel has mentioned, right, about this direct, data monetization approach, where people would be the ones, selling their own data to pharma, right? And believe it or not, when we started Longenesis back in the days, 2 years ago or so, this was our first concept, right? This was, how do you enable people to monetize their data directly with the pharmaceutical industry? But what we have found out is that it is a bit of a utopian thing still, right? Because we're still there to solve the problem of data interoperability. Data should be structured. Data should be well annotated, right? And it's really not of a big value if we're talking about a compilation of individuals just sharing their own clinical data, which will be all over the place, right? So it's still the patient custodians that should be equipped. To be completely honest with you,
I think, an important dose of realism there. Torsten actually asked a question just along these lines, and again, please do use the question panel, everyone, to post your question. He asked, what solutions exist to connect patients and researchers directly without relying on siloed data, and how can patients be encouraged to actually sell their data? Well, we've got into that discussion, and perhaps selling is the wrong concept here, but it's active participation that we're looking at. But I think, Sergey, if I'm right, what you were saying is there will continue to be a need for trusted custodians, intermediaries, in order to participate. At the moment, health systems tend to be highly trusted. So I know in the UK, if you look at the most trusted custodians of confidential data, the NHS is the #1 institution in the country. Unfortunately, private companies are pretty low down. And so there is clearly a need for partnership with health systems. And as you described it, a partnership between kind of researchers, patients and clinicians, rather than just a direct relationship between the two. Is there anything, I mean, have you seen technologies, are you developing them yourselves that are really good at establishing the kind of relationship, the solutions that Torsten's talked about?
Indeed. So at Longenesis, we actually solved it via a string of two key products of ours, right? So Longenesis essentially operates with two key products. One is called Longenesis Curator, and the other one is called Longenesis Themis. So Longenesis Curator is essentially the data dashboard or the data interface which can be essentially split into two parts, where one part of it is used by what we call data publishers. Data publishers are essentially the biomedical institutions, not only hospitals, also patient organizations and other, also AI companies for that matter, that have data in store. This is where they have the ability to post their anonymized metadata sets. So the data would always stay in the institution. The data would always stay local. They would only post the anonymized metadata metrics about what do they actually have or what type of patient reach do they have, right? On the other hand, Curator is used by study sponsors, so pharmaceutical companies, CROs, for real-time querying of this metadata and real-time request posting directly to these institutions, right? So essentially, a study sponsor can achieve a cohort search, right, or perform a cohort search, which would otherwise take them multiple months to do in 2 minutes, right? And post a direct request to a series of hospitals that actually hold these patients that might be fit for the clinical trial, for example, right? And then once you have done this, Longenesis Themis is actually the tool, the patient engagement tool, which is deployed at the hospital level. And this is where the hospitals actually have the ability to digitally onboard the patients. And this is where the patient centricity is key, right? So digitally onboard the patients, guide them through the consent management process, right? So present them with a custom consent form, identify them in the proper way, as well as give the patients all the rights to modify their permissions, answer additional questions if we're talking about some sort of pre-filtering of patients according to inclusion-exclusion criteria for a specific clinical trial, generate real-world data from them, or essentially gather quality of life metrics, whatever they want to do. But what this does is essentially covers the whole cycle of legitimate identifying, right? So because the data stays local, and then proper onboarding into a clinical study, right? So this is how, indeed, this is how we solve this problem, right? So providing the two stakeholders this end-to-end approach and the ability to communicate directly.
Great, thank you, Miguel. Well, you're the practicing clinician here. You're seeing people and patients every day. We sort of skirted around the topic, the title of this event, Who Owns My Data? When a patient is there and getting, no doubt, excellent dentistry care from you, do they care about who actually owns their data? Is this just a sort of arcane consideration?
That's a brilliant question. First of all, I think that would have a different answer depending on what demographic you are, what part of the world you're in. I'm certain if you ask, I think that would have to do with the trust people have in their governments locally. So this is a global conference. So my answer is based on living in a European country where the trust, I guess, in institutions is quite high. I have a very international community of patients, and I'm a private practitioner. So these are usually people that are educated and can afford private healthcare. So to answer your question, no, I've never been asked, where is my data stored? We do have a few family offices. We treat a few public figures that they might ask, in terms of privacy, how these things work. And we do have all of the fireworks in place. But what's very interesting is that there's absolutely no regulation on that. But to flip that question on its head and pivot a little bit, I would like to say that I think that this data, and if you do have a custodian in the future regarding public healthcare, and even private healthcare for that matter, I think that it would be very interesting to, there's two sides of this coin. Is the doctor doing things properly? And I think that in a certain sense, there's no true oversight in how doctors are actually doing their work. There's just a huge element of trust from who's hiring that doctor, be it a private group or be it the government. And there's a huge amount of trust from the patient to the doctor, and also there's a huge amount of trust from the doctor and the patient. And that trust is something that is the foundation of any relationship between a doctor and a patient. It's the absolute, since Hippocrates, it's the absolute foundation. And I think trust is eroding. I just did a podcast on that where I discussed that trust in organizations is failing. And you just said it's very high on the NHS and quite lower in the private sector. I'm sad to hear that. Why? And I think that if we could somehow police this data in a sense that we can understand if people are doing the right thing. And I think that this is something for me that's very interesting to debate. And I'd be very curious to have this discussion even after this, is that data is being acquired. Not only who's harvesting it and who's owning it, but what's being done with it, is that ethical? And I think that we need to have a huge understanding of who's these companies that are involved in the whole process. Are they supervising that things are being done ethically? Are the gold standards of healthcare in 2021 being upheld? And are doctors doing the right thing? And moreover, are patients doing the right thing? Because imagine you've got a patient that misbehaves in clinic A, quits, ruins that doctor's life for whatever reason, and then goes to patient B, Dr. B, and that Dr. B has no way of understanding if that patient is actually, a problematic patient. So I think the sharing of data is something that could be very beneficial for medical teams within the healthcare sector at protecting themselves. It can also be very helpful for patients to protect themselves against negligent doctors. And I think that's also something that really needs to be looked into.
Yeah, so what you're talking about here is quite a sort of radical approach to transparency, not of the data itself, but of the uses of that data,
Yes.
as well as bringing in multiple sources. And I guess a question that follows from that is when you, and this is, I'll ask Miguel you first and then come to Sergey. As you look at sort of advances in computer science, do you see solutions that are going to enable us to do things that we could not do before, where before we might have been reliant on a state inspector or an ethical panel to have a look and see whether people are doing things properly? Inevitably these can be gamed, they're flawed, they're human. Can technology help to preserve privacy, to provide that trust back in a way that is going to unlock the potential of the data?
I love this question. I lectured on this at the American Dental Association in 2019. Are consumers and technology changing the future of our profession? And the answer is yes. For example, let's say you go to a high street clinic and you think, oh my God, he's a high street doctor, he has to be good. Most probably if you want to follow the money, is the money going into the rent and the lifestyle? What are you paying for? So if you actually follow the money, and that's something that you couldn't do in an analog practice. But in a digital practice, if the files are digital, the patient has a way of understanding what was done with his information, with his x-rays, with his scans, with his files. And in the future, I think that companies will definitely be looking into understanding the entire workflow, and the patient can follow their money to see how much of that actually went back into their lifestyle, into their health, and how much went to fund the practitioner's lifestyle and whatever, marketing, so on and so forth, which you won't see on, like in governmental hospitals, because, the government is supporting this. But in private healthcare, I think it would be very, very interesting to follow the money. And that's something that this technology will definitely allow patients to do. And I think that will also help eliminate unethical practitioners around the world, which is one of my missions.
Yeah, that's a really good use case. Sergey, when you look at this from a technical point of view, and I make my confession here that I am not a data scientist, but when you look at it from a technical point of view, what kind of technologies or techniques are you using to provide the highest levels of privacy and actually not only do the right thing, but actually reassure people that this is a secure system, that this incredibly personal data about them will be safe and well used?
Well, that's a good question. So it actually has two parts. It has the tech part, and then it has the ideological sort of patient education part, right? So the ideological part is basically consists from the fact that patients should be sure that his or her data would never actually leave the clinical institution, right? It would actually stay local, whatever purpose, whatever research, right? Whatever exposure, it would actually stay local, even if it's being legitimately accessed by the third party. So that's one thing. The second is on the tech part. So this is what I have already mentioned. It's patient centricity, right? So when building our products, what we ensure is that patient is given ultimate transparency rights in terms of supervising the consent permissions, in terms of supervising sort of the any sort of data sharing or data usage permissions associated with him or her that he or she gave within a specific research, right? And if you look into how data is shared in general, you would see that you would need to essentially provide a patient with a new consent form for every other new event of clinical data usage, right? So, and this is something that should be presented in the entirety by to the patient, right? So this is ultimately the patient centricity we're talking about. And then, of course, on the deeper technical level, we're also using, in order to log patient consent permissions, right, and any other sort of permissions using the data, we're also using a private distributed ledger, right? So private blockchain, in order to essentially timestamp everything that has been done or has been permitted by a certain patient with a certain ID number, et cetera, so that when it comes to the audit, you basically have the immutable ledger of what has happened with a certain data item, whether it has permissions to be used by the third party, et cetera, This is also very important for the study sponsors, because when the study sponsor comes in, what they need to be sure is that if they will be using this data for any sort of clinical research afterwards, and if this clinical research would end up with the regulator at some point of time, the regulator would actually be checking whether the data was used legitimately, right? So whether the consent permissions were obtained from the patients. And this is where distributed ledger technology would also work, because what you can present the regulator with is essentially the log of transactions, it's called, right? So as you can see, multiple layers there in terms of how you ensure patient centricity and transparency.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And I'm just going to put one more shout out to anyone from the floor. Any questions from the audience? While hopefully those are coming in, we've got a few minutes left. We've talked about various forms of data that are being collected, how to bring them together, how to make sure that that is done in a secure and useful way and generate public trust. What new forms of data should we be thinking of bringing on stream that are actually going to be useful for biomedical research? And they might not even be health data. They might be data about my tax and my social security, about my education. Actually, still very personal data about me that has clinical value when applied in this setting. What sort of, how far can this field expand?
Well, I actually think that it's a very interesting discussion. Health insurance. Let's just break it down to dental. Let's say I've got a dental insurance, and right now the current offers on the market are, let's say, level. I've got entry level, medium, and supreme. And I'll pay a basic fee or a very high fee, and depending on how much I pay a month, I will have more rewards with that. But how accurate is that? And I think that the harvesting of data from like CT scans, intraoral scans, and moreover, the patient's lifestyle choices. Do they smoke? Do they not smoke? Do they go to a gym? How many times a day do they brush their teeth? There's intelligent toothbrushes now that can communicate. So I think the Internet of Things and collecting and mining data around the patient's lifestyle and specific choices, even down to like the supplements they take, what kind of water they're drinking, how much sport they do. All of these things can contribute to overall health. And I think insurance companies and governments that support the medical bills of its population will want to know and should know how healthy these patients are. I mean, you've got patients right now in some government-supported healthcare programs that drink, they smoke, they have very unhealthy lifestyle choices, and expect taxpayers to pay for their health bills without any mitigating circumstances. And I don't think that that's fair for people that actually do practice very healthy lifestyles and make the right decisions and contribute. So I think that sharing of data will inevitably have to be shared.
So Miguel, just to follow that, I'm going to ask you how comfortable would you be about the Portuguese government knowing all that and more information about you, and running the risk of that information being hacked or in other words becoming public?
Well, I'll give you an example. If in Portugal you want to buy a house and you're going to the bank for a loan, you have to do an HIV test for the last 20 years. And if you take that test goes first to the insurance company that's going to be allowing the bank to give you money. For 20 years they've been doing that, and that was never an issue before. Is that uncomfortable? Yes. But again, if you want to be off the grid, be off the grid. If you want to contribute to the collective well-being of your government, you do that just by paying taxes. So if you're paying taxes, would I be comfortable? If I think that it's for the overall good, I wouldn't have a problem. If I have something that I don't want people to know about me, I'll stay off the grid and stay completely private.
Interesting. I wonder how much cultural context matters here. Sergey, what about you?
Well, look, I think the discussion about how do you tangle the clinical data into the other sort of related areas such as insurance, et cetera, it's a very interesting one. Although I would be very much aware of the discussion where at some point you're actually risking to turn this into a social credit rating system, and you don't want to go there, right? There are very good examples in the market, by the way, how real world data gathering, specific real world data gathering, is then sort of tangled into the insurance space. One is, for example, Cardiogram, right, which is an app for your Apple Watch. And this is where you consent to actually share your heart rate data. And then the company has partnered with the insurance providers, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how you actually get the benefits, right? The insurance discounts because you're living the healthy lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. Although, again, it is, on the global scale, it is a bit of a two-sided stick, right? Because this is where you are walking on thin ice of discriminating some people because of them having poor health, right? And that's something you will not avoid. Now, on the other hand, generally speaking, technology now gives us the opportunity to generate real-world data, from patient cohorts or from people that are not patients yet, but who are at risk, right? And this is also very important. So this is something, for example, Longenesis has done in the Baltic area, where we have built our own tool in order to identify women with high risk of breast cancer, who are essentially, these are healthy women. They're not diagnosed, but they have high risks of getting breast cancer, where we've built our own model and sort of risk calculation algorithm. And this is how you can engage these people early. Yeah. And this is how you can provide them with early guidance. And this is how you can essentially, streamline them to visit the doctor, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is how you can use essentially biomedical data or basic sort of data that you gather from them or ask them to fill in order to contribute to public health, right? So and prevent certain diseases. So it's another sort of neat use case of how you're not exactly touching clinical data that is in the hospital, but rather generate data from healthy people.
Yeah, and that's where your point about having a trusted intermediary so that you can have that direct relationship is so important. We're just going to wrap up now after what's been, I'm sure everyone will agree, a fantastic conversation. Miguel, some last thoughts on you. What can we achieve here, and what do we need to be careful of while we do it?
Well, I think that the bigger question is, this all comes down to trust. And at the end of the day, the relationship between a patient and their doctor for thousands of years has been one patient in the privacy, like a confession, with their doctor. And now the big question is technology is blowing that up. And the question is a doctor alone? And I think that nowadays with technology, a doctor isn't alone. He represents a network. And the more technology we have, the more data we have, the bigger that network. And I think at the end of the day, the better the medicine provided to the end user. And we have to trust the system. And I hope that we can create mechanisms to build that trust even more in the future.
Thank you. Sergey, some final thoughts from you.
Well, the final thoughts are very very simple ones. What we should do is we should focus on non-invasiveness with the data custodians and clinical data providers, right? So we should not fiddle with their internal AMR systems. Rather, we should keep the data local. We should respect that. We should build our data usage concepts around patient centricity and patients being fully informed about how that data is actually being utilized, right? So I think that, and this is the future of biomedical research as we see it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, it's a fantastic session. Thank you so much to Miguel and Sergey for your comments. It is extraordinary that we are moving to a collective approach to medicine in order to deliver a more personalized approach, and data is at the heart of that. Thank you so much indeed. And Ian, over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Sergey and Miguel. Fantastic moderated, fascinating discussion, teasing apart those concepts of value and consent. It's such a fine line that researchers, clinicians, policymakers are treading, working with technologists on how to manage patient data, figuring out who owns it, who is owed what. I'm sure this conversation could have continued for hours, but we must adhere to the schedule. So coming up in just over 20 minutes at 12 BST will be sustainability, where our panelists will answer the question, can the decentralized world of crypto and blockchain assist the world in creating better sustainability? And what's it doing about its own sustainability? This is the Open Web Forum at CogX, curated by Fabric Ventures, and I'll see you back here in 20 minutes.